And we're back. Hope
Hello.
everyone is rested, stretched, hydrated, all of those things. We are back with Nick. How do you say your last name? Is it Laughter or Lauder?
It's laughter.
Oh, okay. That's what I thought it was, but I was like, that could go either way. Anyways, Nick, want to say hi to everyone before we kick off?
Hi, everyone, before we kick off.
I knew you were going to do that. As a reminder, the Slack channel is in the banner below, day one, Nick Laughter. Ask your questions there by all means, and then we will also do live Q&A at the end of the talk. So without further ado, enjoy.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining my presentation on advocating for neurodiverse-inclusive policies. You're likely here because either you or someone you know is neurodiverse themselves, or you saw the word inclusive, and that's kind of a hot-button word. So either way, you're likely somebody who has some interest in creating a world where everyone belongs, and that's pretty cool. So welcome. My name is Nick Laughter, and I am actually autistic. I was diagnosed as an adult, and my diagnosis was termed severely autistic with high adaptability. Essentially what this means is that I still have very strong autistic urges, but I'm very good at pretending that they don't exist. Now, you've likely heard the term autism before, but maybe asking what neurodiversity actually is. And it is defined as the range of differences in individual brain function and behavioral traits regarded as part of normal variation in the human population. Now, many people looking at this list are probably most familiar with ADHD and autism, and those are actually the two that I will be speaking from because they're the two that represent me. But so many other people are represented by this list and by the term neurodiversity. It often refers to autism, so I may use those terms interchangeably, but there are a number of conditions which are often comorbid with autism that it could be referring to. So with that being said, let's take a quick moment and talk about what autism actually is. It is defined as a broad range of conditions characterized by challenges with social skills, repetitive behaviors, speech, and nonverbal communication. But it is so much more than that, which we'll actually get into in a minute here. It is estimated that 1 in 54 children in the US will be diagnosed with autism, and it is a spectrum. So each person that you meet with autism has a distinct set of strengths and challenges. There's actually a funny saying in the autistic community that once you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And as funny as it is, it actually does a good job of portraying the fact that our strengths and challenges are so unique to us. Now, I would like to take a quick moment to debunk a couple myths about autism. And the first being that people don't grow out of it. We do learn ways that we can hide or, again, mask certain aspects of our autism, but it never goes away. It never lessens. And part of that is because there's no cure for it. It is just a lifelong condition. A lot of people don't like the term condition because that does sort of elicit a thought of some type of malady or illness. And I don't believe that I have some type of illness, but it is a disability. And the fact that there's no cure and people don't grow out of it comes from the fact that it is genetic. And I feel ridiculous having to say this, but no, it is not caused by vaccines. So just a little bit more of a basic understanding of what autism is it's more than just thinking or acting differently. Everybody in the world thinks and acts differently. That doesn't have anything really to do with it. But it's actually a completely different perspective or perception of reality. Everything to us can be processed completely differently than how most typical brains process information. So probably the best metaphor that I've come up with is it's not like different colored lenses like a lot of people think. It's like different types of sight or different technology altogether. So take, for example, this series of images. Now the left and the right sides are the same thing, but with the left, it's viewed with infrared, and the right is viewed with thermal imaging. Now, even though they're the same image on both sides, they look completely different. And that's because of how the image is being processed. And again, it's not a perfect metaphor because basically everybody sees some things differently than everybody around them. With autism, we actually process the information in our brain differently. So, with all of that being said, thank you for watching. Together, I believe that we can affect change for the positive. So let's begin. My approach to advocating for neurodiverse-inclusive policies comes in 3 parts, or steps. The first is to look at roadblocks that exist that make it difficult for autistic people to enter any given company and also to succeed while they're there. The next is to look at benefits that exist for why it's good for everybody, for businesses to embrace neurodiversity. Not just good for those of us who are on the spectrum, but it's also good for the people who work there and the businesses themselves. Lastly, we will look at action that you as an individual can take to help move things along. So, let's start with roadblocks. Now, we really can't talk about neurodiversity as a whole without talking about overall diversity and inclusion. Now, Josh Burson, who's an HR genius, did a ton of research with his team. And they found that while the majority of companies do believe that they have implemented policies that are advanced in diversity and inclusion efforts, just over 1/10 of them truly understand the depth of the problem. Which means that for every company out there that has all of these statements on their website about how they embrace diversity and inclusion and women in leadership, people of color, etc., really only about 1 out of 7 of them actually understand how far it goes. And I believe what it comes down to is that it's easy to dismiss a problem as solved or not even there when you're not the one that has to suffer from it. Take, for example, stairs. Now, stairs have been around for a while, so have people in wheelchairs, but it really wasn't until quite recently that we decided we should make everything accessible to people in wheelchairs as much as possible. There are laws around it. And that's because technology exists to simplify lives. And we as technologists have a responsibility to use it to simplify as many lives as humanly possible. You know, like with stairs, the vast majority of people get by fine the way things are, but some people can't. And if we have the ability to open up the possibility for others to work just as efficiently with some minor adjustments, why wouldn't we? And herein lies the problem with neurodiversity. If I put this image in front of you and ask you where the disability is, well, it's your best guess. There may not even be one. And the issue here is that neurodiversity often is an invisible disability. And the more neurodiverse people that want to work, the more it necessitates changes in how companies function. And that can't happen until companies recognize that there is a problem to begin with. So, let's take a look at a few common issues that many people that are neurodiverse or on the spectrum have with the way that most businesses operate. First, we'll talk about the dreaded open workspace. Now, I know most of you who are not autistic have problems with this, which should only go to paint the picture of how awful they are if you are autistic. One of the biggest problems, obviously, being distractions. To a typical brain, a distraction is maybe just a small bump in their overall productivity. If somebody comes by and taps you on the shoulder, yeah, you got interrupted. And even if you completely lose your train of thought, it's not impossible for you to get it back. For people that are autistic, this can be the difference between a productive day or ending up being a ball of nerves when we get home. And that is further compounded by sensory overload. If your office has fluorescent lighting, sounds, certain other issues in how people get your attention, maybe by snapping at you or tapping you on the shoulder, because information is processed differently by a neurodivergent brain, this can actually be catastrophic to a person's mental health. And it's difficult for people who are not autistic to understand how it can really be that severe. But again, that's the point, is it's easy to ignore a problem when you're not the one that has to deal with it. And this, again, is further compounded by a lack of security. Now, if you're at all familiar with agoraphobia, this is an overwhelming sense of threat or danger in open spaces. It is a neurological condition that people have, but it actually is comorbid with many people that are autistic as well. And it's not even necessarily because of something that has actually happened. It just comes down to, again, how information is processed by our brains. I know if I am working in an open environment and it's just the culture that somebody can come by and tap me on the shoulder while I'm so focused on my work, it actually causes my adrenaline to spike. It makes me incredibly anxious and jumpy, and it's an awful, awful experience. And I don't expect people to just know that about me, but it's just an inherent issue in an open workspace, something that companies tend to love. Another issue with how a lot of companies function is this embrace of unpredictability. And I get it. Sometimes a top priority issue pops up and we have to have a meeting about it right now to figure things out. Usually it's not that big of a deal, but I get it. It can happen. The problem is when it's the norm. And for people who are autistic in particular, but even other, again, comorbidities, unfamiliarity equates in our mind to hostile territory. Those of us who are on the spectrum absolutely require the ability to anticipate things that are going to happen. Now, this again kind of comes back to having a culture where people can just come tap you on the shoulders or interrupt your flow. But even more than that is just as a company, if I, as a potential employee, don't have the ability to anticipate what my day is going to look like or what potential issues could come up during the day that I have to account for, it makes it incredibly difficult for me to even survive in that type of an environment. And this kind of turns out that sudden change is bad. They're really, really hard for us. Most of this is because for a typical person, say you wake up in the morning, your alarm goes off, you roll out of bed, you brush your teeth, you hop in the shower, you just go through your typical morning routine. Many of you probably, prior to COVID and everyone working from home, probably wound up in the office and didn't even really put much thought into your day until you got there. Some of you probably didn't put much thought into your day until you got home. But for those of us who are autistic, from the moment that we are conscious until the moment that we fall back asleep, every aspect of our reality is being constantly processed. So when I wake up in the morning, I am immediately aware of the position that my body is in, the temperature, if I feel too hot or a little cold. I'm immediately aware of how thirsty I am, if I'm a little bit hungry, everything. Immediately, it's a flood of information that dumps into my brain. And that's why sometimes I have a hard time just having a conversation with people. It's not because I just can't process information quickly enough to keep up. It's because I'm processing so much information at any given time that it's like, whatever the thing that you just said to me that you need a response to, it's in line. It's I'm multi-threading. We're all developers. I'm multi-threading and I'm dealing with a lot of processes all at once, and I'll get to your thing when my brain gets to it. And this is just the reality of people who are on the autism spectrum. It comes across as though sometimes we're stupid or dumb. And it's not that, it's just that there's so much noise that when you suddenly throw in, oh, we're having a meeting real quick, or oh, we're not going out to lunch, we're going to order lunch here or whatever. Suddenly, all of the thinking that we've done for that day gets interrupted. It comes to a grinding halt, and we now have to restructure our thought process for the rest of the day to accommodate this quick change that you just threw in. Again, for most people, it's not a problem. For us, it is. And this oftentimes is caused by a lack of communication. Most people evaluate verbal communication as being inherently better than text-based communication. And I understand, again, for people that don't have to be continuously processing information throughout their entire existence, I get it. You want to come up and chat about the weather or what you did on the weekend, that's fine. If I've got 1,000 things through my head that I'm trying to process and emotionally tackle, and then you come up and want to tell me about how your dog got lost, it's going to be rough. You can send it to me on Slack or email or something. But the problem is that in most workplaces, people don't really see these two types of communication as being equal. For instance, if I were to send you a Slack message, you, depending on who you are, might not even really read it. You might not even really think it's that big of a deal. And that's because you've probably spent your entire life expecting that if people have something important to bring up to you, that they will come up to you to bring it up. And this one aspect puts autistic people and neurodivergent people at a huge disadvantage in the workplace, because we need to be able to have something given to us and to process it when we're able to formulate an appropriate response, and then to give that response to you. And yeah, it's not super easy, but it's what we need if we're going to succeed and even just be comfortable working with you. And another issue that I have personally seen is that this comes down to trust. Now, we, autistic people, because of the way that our brains often operate, we don't usually do things because it's for our best interest. Again, because we're processing so much information at any given time, we're usually some of the most candid and honest people that you'll meet. And I'll explain why that is in a little bit here. But because of that, we often don't have the ability or capacity to process if the person talking to us is being equally truthful with us. Now, everyone has had their trust abused in the past. Some, maybe not quite this drastically, but we've all had people lie to us or take advantage of us. For an autistic person, we typically depend on the other person not to do that to us. And I know that probably sounds a little bit silly to somebody who doesn't know what I'm talking about. But the reality is that we are incredibly vulnerable people. We have a tendency to just blanketly trust whatever you say to us. And we are often taken advantage because of that. So this, of course, continues on to misaligned priorities. We usually speak our mind, or at least do our best to convey what we're thinking or feeling. And a lot of times, because conversations typically happen in person, things get missed. And so when you put us in a situation where we are expected to keep up with conversations as they are happening, we're not going to really get everything that's being thrown at us. And the best metaphor that I've been able to come up with this is if you can imagine working amongst telepaths. So to paint the picture in your mind, imagine that you, as a typical human person, have crash landed on a planet. And it's just like our planet. Everybody looks the same, they talk the same, they somehow speak the same language. And it's almost like you've been there your whole life. But you learn eventually that something is happening that you're missing. And through conversations and maybe going to doctors to determine what's wrong with you, you learn that everybody else on this planet has the ability to convey emotions telepathically. So when they say something, they use regular words for it, but they also send a telepathic emotion along with what they're trying to convey. You cannot receive this telepathy, and nor can you send it. And so you end up spending your whole life around people who think you're rude, or who think that you are dumb, and you just say things sometimes that are just off color or random, and that's your reality now. This is the reality of autistic people. Because of the way that society is structured around verbal communication and expecting people to receive and send information at the same time, it puts us at a drastic disadvantage. And it leads me to one of my favorite quotes, which a lot of people attribute to Einstein. Fun fact, doesn't actually have any evidence that Einstein ever said it, but the quote goes, "Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid." And this summarizes the lives of so many autistic people, myself included. I lived for 27 years thinking I was just stupid, that I was incapable of succeeding in college and incapable of having basic conversations with people. And it took me at 27 years old talking to a psychologist to discover that it's not that I'm stupid, it's just that climbing a tree is not the thing that I'm best at. And this ultimately leads to inflexibility in the workspace, primarily in rigidity in the work environment. There is often a tendency for bosses, but other people, to have an attitude of, well, it works for me. And this is incredibly toxic, because if your entire office culture is based around the concept that whatever the majority likes best is what goes, you're not going to be a very diverse culture. And this leads to forced self-advocacy and self-disclosure. And this sucks, because as a disabled person with an invisible disability, I would love to be able to work with people that I didn't have to say, hey, I'm autistic, so I might say something dumb sometimes and just don't think too much of it. Now, maybe this is a dream world scenario, but it's still my dream. So here I am giving presentations about it. And one other issue with this inflexibility is time or location requirements. Now, obviously, right now, with the way the world is on fire, location requirements aren't as big of an issue as they still are, as they used to be. But I'm still seeing, when people post job listings in some of my Slack communities, almost invariably, it'll say, remote is fine for now, but soon you'll be required in X city or state, and to work in office, etc. And to me, that, again, just conveys a level of ignorance that some people can't really do that. And they can contribute in huge ways to your company, but are still unable to meet these certain requirements. Many people with autism, neurodiverse people, have a disorder that makes it impossible to go to sleep at a certain time. Their circadian rhythm is literally delayed by hours. Why do they have to be up at 8 in the morning or 7 in the morning or 6 in the morning to be able to do the same job that they could do for you if you maybe pushed your meetings back a little bit longer or had text-based meetings to begin with? Again, I understand it's maybe a dream world scenario, but it is my dream. So, to summarize with Roadblocks, we have the fact that this disability is invisible to most people. Traditional workspaces can cause major issues. Scheduling can cause major issues. And the environment can cause major issues. And all of this together can lead to neurodivergent people not feeling great about working there. So, this is a tall order. I've asked for a lot of things to be addressed and changed. So let's take a quick minute and talk about why you should. And the whole concept of benefits comes down again to diversity and inclusion. Now, we should talk about the legality of it, that the Americans with Disabilities Act does prohibit any company from not allowing a person to work or have some kind of basic accommodation just on the basis of them being disabled. You can't just say, hey, even though you're in a wheelchair, we can't hire you at our call center or to be a developer or whatever. Hey, just because you're blind, we can't expect you to work on computers. There are plenty of tools to overcome that. And the Americans with Disabilities Act has provided a level of protection for disabled people that was never there in the past. But that legality is still there. So, diversity and inclusion, it's not just the right thing to do, it is the law. So, the legal aspect is probably the biggest benefit, that you won't get sued, which is cool. But there's more to it than just that. Now, Stephen Covey said that strength lies in differences, not in similarities. And I love this because it does portray the aspect of diversity being that different people have different things to bring to the table. If everyone in your workspace looks and thinks just like you, they're redundant. There's no need for them to even be there. So, again, diversity and inclusion by itself has benefits for your company. Now, research, again, has it that diverse organizations outperform competitors by 35%. So if you want to be a good business and you want to be a successful business, invest in diversity and inclusion. Now, again, back to Josh Bersin, who I quoted previously, said that it's not just a business strategy. It's not just an HR program. It's a business strategy. You will invariably outperform your peers. But autism specifically offers many benefits to your business if you know how to embrace them. So let's discuss some of the strengths that autistic people can bring to the table. First is that autistic people can be known as crusaders for justice. We tend to have an overwhelming sense of right and wrong, and usually this dictates to us how we handle certain situations. We often approach things with, like I mentioned previously, brutal honesty. And we are often overwhelmingly sincere because of the way that information processing works in our brains. We usually don't have time to think of how to BS our way through a situation or how to lie about certain things. It just doesn't usually occur to most of us. There's a greater purpose we have than self-interest, which comes out in uncanny objectivity. We very seldom, if ever, have any kind of hidden agendas. And this comes because we usually like to approach things in terms of what's best for the company or the team or even our individual well-being. But it doesn't usually come into how we can benefit or advance ourselves. And it's because typically when we think about things, reasons for doing something, we tend to filter out our personal interest from pros and cons. We, like I said, tend to have this uncanny objectivity, and we usually desire to just get to the bottom of things. Even if something goes wrong and we are to blame, we would rather just know what happened than to worry about saving face and not having made any mistakes. And this is paired by an extreme focus that we tend to have. We are usually obsessed with completion. And we are often people with deep passions and interests. And because of that, we are usually particularly detail-oriented, and we generally have a great memory. Sometimes. I can recall things that happened when I was 3 years old like it was yesterday, but I don't even remember what I had for lunch yesterday. So maybe so, maybe not. But this is furthered by what I like to refer to as robotic efficiency. We tend to tackle things with a let's go attitude instead of thinking, well, what's stopping us? We sometimes tend to jump in feet first. And yeah, this can be hectic or chaotic, but in the right environment, this can drive your team and company to levels you never thought you could get to before. And yeah, we're neurodiverse, so diversity higher? Yeah, I mean, we'll go with it. Again, diversity on its own merit is a good thing. So I'm okay capitalizing on that a little bit. Again, a different perspective of the world leads to a different perspective of the problems that you have. And it means that we can bring unique solutions to problems that matter. And this will invariably lead to greater success in your business and company. So this wraps up the benefits. Again, there is legal protection. It is important for you as a company to embrace diversity. You will experience greater business success, so it shouldn't be too difficult to convince your C-level to invest in it, because ultimately it's an investment into the own company. It will affect culture and loyalty. People will be more happy not constantly being around everybody that's just like them. And it is the right thing to do, sure. But beyond all of that, autistic, neurodiverse people do have unique strengths that can be brought to the table that can be leveraged in the right environment. So, all of that being said, let's talk about some action that you as an individual can take. The whole world is working remotely right now, and it is a great opportunity to implement policies that don't put autistic people back at a disadvantage when life goes back to normal. Even if you yourself are not a manager or C-level executive, you can personally make a huge difference in your workplace. So let's start there. The first thing you can do is to get involved at work. So maybe first pressure your boss. You can ask some very serious questions that will get the ball rolling on how your company can help people like me to not only get a foot in the door and a seat at the table, but to actually succeed and to contribute to the company in ways that help everyone. Another thing that you can do is, by bringing these questions up to your boss, you can yourself get involved. First, never assume that these things are in place. They probably are not. So by you simply raising these questions, it can highlight areas in your business where neurodiverse people might not be able to succeed. And a best way that you can get educated on these issues is to get involved online. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of communities for autistic adults on Facebook that welcome people who want to become an advocate. There are dozens of resources online that you can go to that will help teach you what you need to know to advocate for neurodiverse people. And you can just simply ask autistic people for their advice. You can, especially if you're online, you can create a post and say, I work for X company, or not even list your company. What policies could we implement that would make it easy for you to work here? You just ask. People just tend not to. And all of this sort of comes to a head when you become an advocate. We need people to help us. So become outspoken at your workplace. Ask people, ask coworkers, and ask your boss what your company is doing to allow people like us to thrive. You can start a committee. You can gather other people that see the need for different brains in your company and get together for lunch a couple times a month. You can also start a community. This one's huge because there might already be autistic people working in your company who feel alone. And because of the nature of autism and the nature of having to ask for accommodations, they may not have self-disclosed to anybody. So by creating a community where they can belong, even if it has nothing to do with the workplace itself, can be a massive first step to becoming neurodiverse inclusive. And be ready for resistance. And this is kind of a crazy thing, but there are so many stories, and I have many myself, where companies just didn't want this. And I get it, because a lot of times it feels like you're just asking for change because it's what you want. And especially where it's an invisible disability, it's easy for people to deny it. But the reality is that we exist and we need help. And you're either going to help us or not. And I hope you choose to. One kind of caveat with all of this is an advocate cannot be our manager. And I know this is incredibly hard, because managers, generally, good managers, see it as their sole responsibility is to empower the people that report to them. And so it can be a little challenging to say you cannot be so-and-so's advocate. But the reason why is because we already feel an overwhelming need to mask, typically. And so being further up the food chain only makes it worse. If you're a manager to somebody who's autistic, the worst thing that you can do to them is to limit their internal advocacy to someone they have to prove themselves to. Even if they don't actually have to prove themselves to you, they're going to feel that way. And they're going to lessen what they need, and they're going to mask more, and it's not going to help. One experience that I've had with this is at a previous company, I was asking for an accommodation. It ended up costing the company absolutely nothing to provide for me. It was easy. It cost them nothing. But they initially absolutely refused because they claimed it would be an undue burden for them. At this company, my manager was my only advocate. And they essentially pitted him against me so that they could get away with not providing me the accommodation that I needed. And they just wanted to get away with it because, well, if we have his advocate on our side, then he doesn't have a leg to stand on with arguing why he needed it. And it took me actually threatening to lodge a complaint with the EEOC for them to actually provide this accommodation for me, which again ended up costing them nothing and worked out very well. But that's usually just the way things work. The reality is that HR departments don't really exist for the employees. They exist to protect the company. And so as a disabled person, if you have an invisible disability, you should be able to trust that you can go to your HR department and request a reasonable accommodation and have it be met. Most often, that's not the case. And so by having an advocate in the company who you don't report to, who you can raise these concerns with, who doesn't even necessarily need to have any kind of power in the company, but who can go to these meetings with you and help go to bat for you, is the single most empowering change that your company can make. And one of the most important things that you can do for these people is to not require them to self-disclose. Just make it available, and if they need it, they'll ask for it. So just to summarize again all of this, you can get involved at your work, you can get involved online, and you can become an advocate. Now, as I wrap up, a couple of thoughts that I had is, can you imagine what America in particular would look like right now if only women advocated for women's rights? Or what would America look like if only Black people advocated for civil rights? Or if only LGBT people advocated for gay rights? Now imagine how neurodivergent people feel. We are often left alone to say, I need this. And usually it's rejected. You know, there's so many posts on Facebook and social media to say, like if you love an autistic person, or like if you support an autistic person, and that's great. But it's not enough if you just love someone with autism. I'm begging you, help someone that's neurodivergent. By becoming an advocate for us and by helping to implement policies now that will help us to join and succeed in your company, you can help us to achieve somewhere that we can belong. And ultimately, that's what we want. So, to wrap up, we have looked at roadblocks that currently exist in many businesses that make it difficult for us to enter and succeed. We've looked at benefits to your company and to you that are just waiting to be taken advantage of. And we've looked at action that you as an individual can take to help to lead your company into a better future for everyone. Thank you again for watching my presentation. You can reach me on Twitter, and I also highly recommend this resource at autisticadvocacy.org. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network is a great way that you can connect and share resources with your company and improve things. Here is my slide of references if you need to get a hold of them later. And again, thank you. So, now it's time for some Q&A.
Okay, I won't lie. Once you pointed out how you say advocacy, that's all I could hear. Oh, wait, you're muted.
There we go. How's that?
Awesome.
Yeah, every time I said it, I was just like, wait a second, that's not a real word. That sounds awkward.
Yeah, as you were wrapping up, I was like, oh, yep, there it is.
I know. I contemplated not saying it until after the presentation, but I didn't contemplate that until after I had already pointed it out. So,
yeah,
which is life.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so we do have some questions. The first one is a question about remote work. Let me move this over so I'm looking a little more at the camera. Did you do it before COVID when you switched from office to remote work, assuming this has happened at some point, but maybe not? What are the benefits and drawbacks to the change?
Yeah, so my previous company that I was at before where I am now, it's actually the company that I had a little bit of difficulties with in achieving my accommodation. And that was basically my request was, we're in this big open environment. There were so many drawbacks for me to being able to be successful there. And so I had approached can you hear me okay? I'm inside of the Starbucks.
Yes, totally can. I was just reading someone else in here. I have my microphone and Slack is making a racket and everyone can hear the Slack claps.
Okay, just making sure. So anyway, so I had gone to the HR department and basically said, look, it's really not working out for me to be here. If you have a place that I can go to, even in office, where I know that I can just close the door and not have to worry about people walking by and interrupting me, then that would be fine. If not, I really just need to work from home. And the culture just was not receptive to that at all. They had a precedent, and the CTO actually of the company had previously had a bad experience with an employee that they had allowed to work remote. And so he had basically just put the hammer down and said, no more remote employees, period. So it was a constant uphill battle. I had actually requested it a couple of times over about a year and a half. And then finally had the experience where I just said, look, I really just need this if I'm going to be able to be productive and successful here. And they continued shutting it down, pushing it back. And over the course of about a month and a half of kind of this back and forth, I eventually just said, look, I know it's not going to cost you guys anything to do this for me, and it will make a world of difference for me. So if you're not prepared to do this, I'm just going to have to go file a complaint with the EEOC and kind of let you hash it out with them. And it was like a couple of days later, they came back and they were like, okay, yeah, we'll let you be remote as long as you have reliable internet and all this stuff. And then of course, as COVID began to hit, their entire company is fully remote now. And so that's part of the frustration is that a lot of times for us, we ask for a certain kind of accommodation just to get us closer to an even playing field with other employees in terms of how we can be successful, and then it gets turned down because it's unreasonable or an undue hardship or something like that. And then of course we have a situation like this where they realize, well, we can actually do that for the entire company and we'll be fine. So that part has been a little annoying, but looking at the silver lining here is that now the whole world sees and realizes that it's really not that concerning to have a remote friendly or even a remote first environment, because otherwise the entire company would have sunk by now with how things are going. So kind of crappy that it took a worldwide pandemic to get to that point. But again, kind of looking at the silver lining, it's hopeful for the future. Anyway,
absolutely. I've definitely seen lots.
Sorry. So the question being, how was the transition for me? So I was working remote prior as part of that accommodation. And the initial transition was a little rough, but it was more based on the culture in the company that, I was mostly out of sight, out of mind. So even though I only lived a 12-minute drive from the office, there were several events like team lunches and other stuff that happened, like a game day during lunch, stuff like that, where I just never heard about it because I wasn't there physically in the office for them to invite me. And so that was a little bit of a rough transition. But in terms of the actual working situation, it was only a better situation for me. There wasn't really any kind of drawback for that transition.
That's good, at least. Another question. Curious how the interaction of ADHD and autism works together in this circumstance. RE focus.
Yeah, so it kind of depends on the day. So autism and ADHD typically, not typically, but it's not uncommon for people with some aspects of one to have some characteristics or traits of the other. And so for me, I find early on in my life, I was on, my ADHD was crazy. I was actually diagnosed when I was 4 years old, which is incredibly young for an ADHD diagnosis. And so growing up, I was put on Ritalin. I was put on Adderall, a couple other drugs. My family tried getting me into different types of therapies. And eventually, through my autistic traits, I basically learned how to leverage the strengths of my ADHD without the constant distraction. And a lot of that basically came in just limiting the potential for unpredictable situations in my environment. And that's why in work environments it's been so difficult, because we don't have control over much of that stuff. So relating this kind of back to school, when I was in high school, completely flunked out of junior high, high school, completely flunked out of college. But with high school, I went to an alternative school in my 11th grade year, towards the end of my 11th grade year. So summer before my senior year and during my senior year. And I had about 3.5 years of credits that I had to accomplish to graduate on time. Because I went to an alternative school writing packets, I was able to just go into my room, work on my packet. Each packet was worth 1/8 of a credit, bust out as many as I could, and then go in the next day to turn them in, take the quiz, and then work on my credits. And over 6 months of my senior year, I was able to do 3.5 years of high school credits to be able to graduate early. At the same time, since I was in this alternative school setting, I had established a student body there. I was a student body president. I had established a newspaper, and so we had the first newspaper for the school. And this was all stuff that I was able to devote my time and energy to working on, because I didn't have to spend all day, every day, just trying to get through the day with all of the craziness that happens in traditional school settings. And so for me, it really came down to the ability to manage my environment and put myself in a situation where I could leverage the strengths of all of these traits that I had, as opposed to having to constantly fight against them just to not have to, buck the system, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I think we got time for one more. How did you come to the conclusion to seek a diagnosis? What led you to think you may process things differently than others?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. So for me, I always had kind of suspected that I was on the spectrum ever since I was in college. I got through like my third failed attempt at college of years in a row, and I just kind of realized, it's just not something that I'm capable of doing, and this kind of led back to this belief that I was just stupid, that the system is set up in a way to work, and I just don't work. And so a lot of that kind of led to, there's got to be an explanation for it. I know I'm an intelligent person, and I know that I have the capability to do incredible things. Why am I so incapable of graduating college or even a single class? And so that was something that somebody had just mentioned. Maybe you're autistic. I know autistic people that have a hard time in school, and I kind of brushed it off at the time, being like, "Well, I'm not autistic." There's I can talk, and all of these misconceptions about what autism actually looks like. And so over several years, I got married and tried working several jobs and got into software around the same time. And I was working for a company doing tech support, and I had an event where a lady had chatted. I was on chat support. A lady had chatted in. She was furious about the service, so she had it canceled, and she was demanding that we pay for all of the repairs for, like, how they drill holes in the wall and the doors for a security company. And our policy was that basically you agree to have those damages done to your home so that we're not liable as a company. And I was just like, well, this is the policy, and they're not going to pay for that as a home damage claim. And so she disconnected the chat. I thought I was done with. And then the next day, I got called into a meeting from my manager, who said that they were putting me on a final written notice because I was so rude to her. They had pulled the transcript, but I was so rude that I wouldn't just send her the information for the home claims department. And there was no kind of documentation for that anywhere. It was never a rule that I was told. And so I was like, well, why am I getting written up for something that nobody told me I needed to do? And he was like, well, that's just the way it is. So at that point, I realized, okay, I'm obviously missing something that everybody around me doesn't seem to be missing. There's so much unspoken communication that seems to be happening that I'm just not getting. And so at that point, I sought out a clinical psychologist that specializes in autism, and made a couple appointments with him, took a couple of tests, and he was like, yeah, you're about as autistic as I come. And I was like, cool, well, that, at least explains the way things are. And so since then, it's been incredibly empowering for me to be able to not just be able to make sense of why I'm different than other people, but to be able to learn about it and to be educated on it in a way that allows me to first off capitalize on what strengths I do have, and then next to that, be able to explain it to other people in a way that allows them to recognize that I don't just want special treatment. I don't just want to work remote because I'm lazy, or I don't want to, put pants on or something like that. It's because it's something that I genuinely need to be able to be close to the same footing as other people that are able to work in a similar setting. And so kind of the thing that I encourage for everybody is, if you or anybody thinks that they might be on the spectrum, or have some of those characteristics, I highly recommend, if you're able to seek out a potential diagnosis or talk to a psychologist, because in my experience, if you can find a good psychologist, which that's a totally different presentation, if you can find a good psychologist or somebody that can diagnose, it can really make the difference between having a life of empowerment and understanding yourself, and continuously going around wondering if there's just something wrong with you.
Makes sense, yeah, for sure. That's good info, and it's good to help point towards finding that information and doing that introspection. Realize maybe this is something I need to investigate.
Yeah, and I'm of course available if anybody has any questions or wants to discuss anything like that. Of course, shoot me a message on Slack, and I'd be happy to use much information as I can.
Absolutely, that's awesome. Yeah, Nick will be around all day. You can definitely, his channel will be active even after this and stuff. There's a few more questions that we didn't get to, so Nick can pop into Slack as well to answer those. And with that, we will take a break.